Oh, hi. Let's talk now about biodiversity. Let's have some basic knowledge regarding the biodiversity, how we measure what is biodiversity, and so we can understand better about the biomes and their biodiversity. So first of all, what is biodiversity? So when we talk about biodiversity, we're talking about the variety of forms on Earth from genes, so from the unit that provides inheritance to individuals, species, and communities and ecosystems. So we're talking about many different levels, many different levels of organization. So in that regard, we're talking also about we're talking about evolutionary and ecological and also cultural process that sustain life on Earth. The word biodiversity is a contraction of two words, biological and diversity, and it was first used in this National Forum on Biodiversity. As you can see here, the letter D, as diversity, is still capitalized here. But then the proceedings of this forum were summarized in this book edited by Edward Wilson, which is one of the most important biologists alive today. And then the book was called Biodiversity. And then from that point on, I guess the term got really popular. And as you can see from this graph here, the use of the word biodiversity grew rapidly in the late 1980s after the term was coined, and really spread really quickly. As it's just for a comparison, here's the term ecology, which has been around, for most of the 20th century, but then it got popular, especially in the 60s and especially in the 70s. It was very popular, but as you see, as the word biodiversity became popular, it almost reached the popularity of the word ecology. This is by counting words in books. It's a Google machine. And then after that, you see that the two words coexist and sort of go together. Okay. Of course, the word also got a lot of popularity because of the Convention on Biological Diversity, which was signed during the World Conference on the Environment that took place here in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, in 1992. So after that, the signing of this convention by almost 200 countries around the globe was a major mark in terms of environmental conservation, and the term biodiversity became more and more popular. And it's interesting because it's popular not only in the scientific literature, it's both in the scientific literature and also in the media, in the common literature. So you see the word spread very quickly. When we talk about biodiversity, I think the first thing that comes to mind is the number of species. Okay, that's so although biodiversity can go from genes to ecosystems, species is usually the coin that's used more often to describe biodiversity. So one thing that we want to do is to count the number of species on Earth, for example. And if we do that, we see that a lot of our diversity is by species of insects. Okay, so insects, we have more than 1 million species of insects described. As you can see here from the graph and also this picture here, which I like, you have this beetle here, just the huge beetle. So the size of the organisms here represent their diversity, the number of species. So you see that's a huge beetle here representing the diversity of insects. Then you have, in second place, you have plants with more than 400,000 species described. Then you have the mushrooms, more than 120,000, arachnids, and then mollusks, and then crustaceans. And then you go on, and look, fish, and so the mammals, for example, are down here, where it's one of the least diverse groups. The mammals are only 6,500 species of mammals. So we have about 2.12 million species described, okay? And then 2.05 million are insects. But, you know, the 2.1 million species that have been described by science, in other words, species that have scientific names and taxonomic classification, um, there are a very small fraction of the real biodiversity of plants, animals, and microorganisms living today. The estimate is that we still have to describe 86% of the species. They're still waiting description. So this is an important task to describe the biodiversity that we have on the planet, and especially with the increasing destruction of the environment. Many species are going extinct before they're even known to science, before they have a proper name. It's like you're dead before you get a birth certificate, basically. Okay, so that's a very important task to describe the biodiversity before it's too late. So of course, biodiversity is not homogeneously distributed throughout the world. You have regions with a lot more diversity than others. And based on that, scientists came up with the idea of identifying biodiversity hotspots. So in other words, those are places that are irreplaceable because they have a lot of species that occur only there, a lot of species that you can find only there. So if this place vanishes from the face of the earth, all the plants and animals and microorganisms that live only there will be extinct. So those are irreplaceable. And the threshold that's used, it's at least 1,500 vascular plants endemic to that area, okay? The other parameter is that this place has to be threatened. And they use this 30% or less of the original natural vegetation left, okay? So the place has both a lot of unique species that only occur there that we call endemic, and also a lot of the original vegetation is gone, okay? So more than 70% is gone. And then when we do that, we identify all these areas around the globe. Here in Brazil, you have the Cerrado. The biome is one of the hotspots, and the other one is the Atlantic forest. Okay, and it's interesting because if you add the surface area of all the hotspots, they only take 2.5% of the Earth's land surface, but they have 43% of bird, mammal, reptile, and amphibian species as endemic to these areas. So they're found only in these areas, okay? So those are the biodiversity hotspots. Another concept that's important here is of wilderness areas. Wilderness areas, different from hotspots, are areas which are really large and are mostly intact. So these are the 24 wilderness areas mapped around the globe. They have more than 1 million hectares, but 70% of them are still intact, okay? So they have a very low human density of less than 5 persons per square kilometer. They take up 44% of the land, okay? But they only 3% of the people live there of the globe. So those are large areas with very few people, okay? And that includes like boreal forests up north, Central Asian deserts, Australian deserts, and so forth. But among all those areas, 5 of them have really high biodiversity, okay, which are the tropical areas. So you have here the North American deserts, the Amazon, okay, Amazonia is one of the wilderness areas here in South America. Then you have the Congo forest, the Miombo-Mapane forest in Africa, and the forests of New Guinea, okay? So these 5 areas, they concentrate a lot of the diversity. So in areas which are still largely intact with not a lot of pressure from humans. So that's another approach, okay? So if you combine the wilderness areas with the hotspot approach, then you have you can preserve both well-preserved areas, the areas that are already well-preserved, but also areas that are threatened, okay? And finally, recently, scientists have pointed out to the importance of mountains for protecting biodiversity. Um, like I said, you have diversity is not evenly distributed. This map here shows the diversity of amphibians, birds, and mammals around the globe, and also the relief, right? The map of the relief showing the mountains. And as you can see, the areas that have the highest biodiversity, such as, in the Amazon here, for example, especially the area in the Western Amazon adjacent to the Andes, so especially parts of Western Brazil, Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. This area is probably the highest biodiversity on Earth, period. Okay, this is where we recorded most species for almost all groups. We also have another area in the Atlantic forest, which has also a combination of mountains and high diversity, also in Africa, also in Asia here, okay? So if you compare here, this graph shows the proportion of land area that is of mountains. So if you take the whole surface area of land on the globe, most of the land is composed of lowlands. But if you think about mammal species, bird species, and especially amphibian species, most of the diversity is on the right-hand side here. So most of the diversity is on mountain ranges. Okay, so mountains are important for biodiversity as well, for generating biodiversity, evolutionarily speaking, and also for maintaining biodiversity in terms of ecological terms, because you have a difference, difference in habitats and in climate and along the mountain. So in a very small geographic area, you have very different conditions, habitat conditions. And of course, tropical forests are, when you think about diversity, you think about tropical forests, because tropical forests, they do have the highest diversity on the planet. When you think about diversity, the same way that a larger place can fit more individuals, okay? A larger place can fit more species, okay? That's what we call the species area relation. So the larger the area, the more species you have. So a small island, for instance, is going to have less animals or plants than a large island or a continent, okay? So when you have large areas, you have more species. But when you look at the globe, that's not exactly what you see. You have large areas in Asia or in North America that don't have that many species, okay? Then you get to what we call the latitudinal gradient of diversity. As you go towards the equator, you have more species. As you go away from the equator, you have less species. So lower latitudes have more species than higher latitudes, both to the north and to the south, okay? This has to do with evolution and also ecology, okay? You have a combination of evolutionary forces driving this pattern and also ecological forces driving this pattern. The other thing that's important is the endemism. So in addition to having lots of species, you have lots of species that only occur there, as I mentioned before. So tropical forests also have a lot of endemic species. So those are species, instead of having a broad geographic distribution, they have very small ranges and occur only in small areas. The habitat complexity of the tropical forest is well known. So you have layers and layers of forest, you have the canopy, you have the understory, you have shrubs. So all this three-dimensional complexity of the architecture of the forest also collaborates with the diversity. And there's a big debate of the reasons why tropical forests have more diversity, and I'm not going to go into that. We could probably have a whole course on that. But what is known is that tropical forests, they serve as we call museums, because the rate of extinction is reduced. So species that evolve there, they just keep going, okay? They don't go extinct. So that becomes a museum, because you have species appearing and then just keep going without a lot of extinction. The other thing is we call them a cradle because a lot of species originate in the tropics and then disperse to other areas. So it's a birth of species is really high, and then they migrate to other areas. And also it's an engine that produces species and also, you know, it's the engine of biodiversity. So a lot of species evolve there. A lot of species, you know, speciation is high in the tropics. So speciation is high, species go to other places and they don't go extinct as easily. So that makes a proper place for biodiversity to evolve. When we measure biodiversity, like I said, there are many, because biodiversity goes from genes to ecosystems, there are many ways to measure biodiversity, okay? So if you talk about genes, we're talking about genetic diversity, okay? We talk about genetic diversity within populations, among populations, for a whole species, within species, among species. So the genetic level, you have many different ways to measure that based on genetic data, genetic DNA sequencing, for example. And then as you go to from the population genetics to species, okay, then that's the level that I said that's most popular, measuring the number of species, for example. Then it's interesting to differentiate between species richness, which is like the number of species that you can find at a given place, and evenness, okay? The evenness is the contribution of each species to the pool of species of a given place. Because you may have in one place, imagine two places with the same number of species. In one place, one species dominates and 90% of the individuals belong to just one species, okay? And the other species have really very few numbers, okay? Whereas in another place, you have an even distribution and all species, they have almost the same, you know, similar frequencies. So that place has it's more even in terms of the number of individuals for a given species. So we believe that's better for biodiversity, okay? So usually the diversity is more associated not only with richness, but also with the evenness. And there are several indices that measure that, okay? So the Shannon index or the Simpson index, or the many mathematical ways to calculate the contribution of each species to the pool and to have like a number associated to the species diversity of a given place. The other thing that's important to understand is that usually the diversity, the number of species at a given in a given place, this is what we call the alpha diversity. So as you see here in this diagram, at each site, for example, at site C, you have the alpha diversity, which is the number of species that we can find at this site, okay? And each site, it's site C, site D, site B, and site A, each site has its own species diversity. When we talk about the diversity among different sites, when we compare the diversity, when you take into account the diversity of site A and site B, that's what we call the beta diversity, okay? So the beta diversity is among different sites, okay? And finally, you can group the sites at a given landscape. So sites A and B are part of the landscape AB, and sites C and D are part of the landscape CD. And when we compare the diversity, when we take into account the diversity of the two areas, you have what we call the gamma diversity. So we are increasing the spatial level of the diversity measurement, okay? So those different scales will give different indexes. There's other ways to see diversity, to measure diversity. One of them is what we call phylogenetic diversity. And that means when you take into account the phylogenetic relationship or the evolutionary relationships among species, which is like what we call the tree of life. So all species on Earth, they are connected to common ancestors at some point along the way. So when we take into account the phylogeny or the evolutionary relationships among species, then you have phylogenetic diversity, okay? So when we talk about, like, you know, species, if you think about a specific group with lots of species, so some lineages have lots of species, like passerine birds. You have lots and lots of passerine birds. So that's part of a lineage of birds. Whereas you have other lineages that have don't have that many species. But when you take into account the phylogeny, you're going to see that sometimes one lineage with few species is equivalent to another lineage which has many species, but they kind of are all around the same lineage, so they are the same phylogenetic or evolutionary trajectory. Okay, and sometimes it's important to save and to conserve unique lineages, animals that are unique, that belong to a very ancient lineage, and they may not be very diverse today, but they represent a history that's imprinted in that lineage. And if they go extinct, you lose a lot of history, a lot of phylogenetic signal. Okay, so phylogenetic diversity takes into account the tree of life, the evolutionary relationships among the organisms. And finally, the functional diversity. Then we're talking about ecological function. So species have different, play different ecological roles in a given community. And so you have, for example, you have herbivores, you have carnivores, you have pollinators. So each of these guilds, each of these groups, functional groups, we can think about functional diversity. Okay, so you can think about the role that that these groups play in the local ecosystem, and then we can talk about functional diversity. Okay, so there are several measures for measuring that, several measurements for measuring that as well. Okay, so depending on the level that we're talking about, depending on the questions that you're asking, you have a different approach to measure biodiversity. Okay.